All right, we are ready to get started. If y'all will give me just a second, I'm going to put us live on Facebook as well so other people can catch us there. So if you're just joining on, I'm Linda Levan, Executive Director of Southern Lit Alliance, and I welcome you to our SouthWord Abridged Literature Festival today. We are having a great lineup and just really enjoying ourselves. So I hope you got a good cup of coffee and are ready for some good discussion about Southern literature. You saw hopefully on the screen our sponsors. Just want to briefly thank them. First Horizon and Mr. and Mrs. Olin Mills have helped put this on, and it's being supported by UTC, have some great professors helping us out today, one of which is our moderator today, Aaron Shaheen. So I want to tell you a little bit about Aaron and welcome him as he's going to get this conversation going. He is currently the George C. Connor Professor of American Literature at the University of Tennessee in the English department. He specializes in late 19th and earliest 20th century literature. And his teaching and research interests include disability, gender studies, Southern literature, World War I, and he's written several books himself. One is The Great War Prostheses in American Literature and Culture, which was published in 2020, and has one coming, I don't know if it's come out already, but this year sometime.
3 more months.
Oh, all right. John Dos Passos, Transatlantic Chronicling, Critical Essays on the Interwar Years. And he has been a speaker at many conferences, including places such as Spain, Portugal, and Sao Paulo, Brazil. So, Aaron, help us get this rolling today.
Well, thanks a bunch, Linda, and thanks to the panelists for being here this morning. It's a real treat. And I think the topic at hand here, Southern literature, past and present, is going to generate some good conversation. And so I'd like to take just a moment to introduce our two panelists, Michel Stone and Steve Yarbrough. And I'll start out alphabetically with Michel, introducing her. Michel's critically acclaimed novels, Border Child and The Iguana Tree, have frequently been compared to the writings of John Steinbeck, and both are in development for television right now. She's the winner of the Mary Frances Hobson Prize for Distinguished Achievement in Arts and Letters, the Patricia Wynne Award for Southern Literature, and the South Carolina Fiction Award. She has published numerous stories and essays, and her novels have been favorably reviewed by The New Yorker, Kirkus, Publishers Weekly, and many others. She has received residencies from the UCross Foundation, the Wild Acres Residency Program, and the Roland Writers Retreat. Michel is actively involved in her community, serving on the boards of several local and statewide nonprofits. She lives in Spartanburg, South Carolina, where she's currently editing the manuscript of her third novel. Our second panelist is Steve Yarbrough, son of Mississippi Delta cotton farmers. Steve is currently a professor in the Department of Writing, Literature, and Publishing at Emerson College. He's the author of 12 books, most recently the novel Stay Gone Days, which is due out in April of 2022, assuming we can get the paper to print it on. His other books are the nonfiction titled Bookmarked, Larry McMurtry's The Last Picture Show, the novels The Unmade World, The Realm of Last Chances, Safe from the Neighbors, and Family Men. His works have been published in several foreign languages and have appeared in Ireland, Canada, and the UK. He's the recipient of numerous awards, including the Mississippi Institute of Arts and Letters Award for Fiction, the California Book Award, the Richard Wright Award, and the Robert Penn Warren Award. He has been a finalist for the Penn Faulkner Award and is a member of the Fellowship of Southern Writers, whose home is here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The Unmade World won the 2019 Massachusetts Book Award for Fiction, and it's a heck of a read, might I say. Steve is an aficionado of jazz and bluegrass, which he plays on guitar, mandolin, and banjo, often after midnight, but not the washboard, apparently. Michel and Steve, thanks again to both of you for being here. I'm mighty grateful to be included in it. So as a scholar of Southern literature, particularly Southern literature of the early 20th century, what's known as the modernist period or modern literature, this is a question I think a lot about: where has Southern literature been? Where is it at present? Where will it be, say, in another 20 years from now? So I'm just going to open up, and Michel, I'll start with you with this general question that in the age of globalization, does Southern literature mean anything anymore? And if so, what is the present state of Southern literature? We'll narrow down these topics a little bit more, but I'll start with that open-ended question.
Yeah, so I think we are in the midst of national obsession with diversity. We hear that word all the time, and authenticity, which is really sort of a dichotomy, because even though we are becoming obsessed with these things, we're at the same time becoming more homogenized and globalized with technology and social media and all these things. So I think people are drawn to stories that show a place and its individuality, its cultural distinctiveness. I think Southern writing does still matter. I think Southern literature will continue to matter, because we do, we've always sort of been the other of the country. And I think we're morphing. I think we're changing. We started off with Faulkner and sort of these genteel writers, and then we got into the dirty South, and now I think this Brit lit, and now I think it's still morphing because of, like I said, this diversity. A friend of mine, Ashley Jones, was just named the Poet Laureate of Alabama, and she's the first person of color to be the Poet Laureate, since that position was established almost 100 years ago, and she's certainly a Southern writer. I think we'll always, in a way, have our distinct voice, but I think that distinct voice is going to continue to morph and change.
Yeah, thank you. Steve, how about you? You're coming, I'm interested in your perspective as well, especially since you're not living in the South right now. You're coming from Massachusetts, of all places. Yankee Land.
I really haven't lived in the South since I was 21 years old. I lived in California for 21 years. I've been up here for a long time. The thing that's certainly always true for me, because I never lost my accent, is that every day, almost every day, somebody will ask me, where are you from? And I really never thought that much about where I was from until I wasn't there anymore. And so as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I agree with everything that Ashley said. I'm sorry, forgive me, that Michel said. But I've always viewed Southern literature as a branch of world literature, not just a branch of American literature. And I think that the influences that Faulkner, for instance, drew on, Alfred Dublin, he denied, I think, reading Joyce, but my guess is that he had. And so I think things are changing. I think they're becoming a lot more inclusive than they were. I have people from my hometown now sometimes call me and say, hey, have you read this new book by Jessamine Ward? Well, yeah, but 30 years ago, most of the white people that I knew in my hometown, they didn't even know there were any writers of color. And I think that's an enormous change that I've seen in my lifetime.
That brings me to my next question: is how has Southern literature changed just over the courses of your careers? I think you've already started us off, Steve, by looking at the wider range of authors identifying as Southern literature authors, but other thoughts on that?
Well, if I can take myself as a case in point, the last three novels that I've written are not set in the South, per se. They all have Southerners in them. And it made me realize, I started going back through Eudora Welty's work, and I realized that my favorite of her stories, they were either about Southerners outside the South, or they were sometimes about non-Southerners in the South, like that great story, No Time for You, My Love. And so I think we're all moving around a lot more. What I would expect to see is I would expect to see a lot of books by writers from the South that are not confined strictly to the South. You know, it's a lot easier to travel now than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And you don't even necessarily have to leave to see the world. It's right there on your computer screen. That's new.
Yeah.
So I think you're going to see more mobility in people's novels, actually. Not everybody's. I don't think Ron Rash is likely to set a book in China, though he's widely read in China. But I think there'll be a lot of mobility in the books.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Michelle, how
Tim.
about you? I noticed with your latest novel, Border Child, that South Carolina is the destination for Hector when he goes there, and Lilia tries to get there, but actually she does get there, and it sort of looms off in this distance as this promised land where they'd like to be long term. And I just thought to myself, what an interesting place, of all the places to set their destination, getting across the border, South Carolina of all places.
Yeah.
Figure in your own writing, and how has it?
So, the South is one of the fastest growing places for the Latina population in the United States. And for me, I've always been a product of the South. From one lot sign, I'm an 8th generation South Carolinian. I married a man from South Carolina. All 3 of my children have grown up here. My older 2 are now in college in the South. And so for me, writing about how the South has changed and is changing really excites me. And particularly growing up in rural South Carolina, where I did, my experience with the Latina friends I've made and how they have enriched the culture so much fascinates me. I think that we will see as time goes on, just as Steve said, that the influence, there will be so many influences that touch our writing and touch these stories that haven't in the past. I mentioned grit lit, that term earlier, which was not even a thing when I graduated from Clemson. I'd never heard of that in 1991 as an English major. And I think it started emerging soon after that. And what is that? I guess it's moving to stories of just the working class folks and sort of the underbelly of the South and what that looks like, and who can tell a story and whose story is worthy. And I think that is shifting. And I think that's a very positive thing. That's only going to enrich the texture of these, of the stories that we're hearing and the stories that we're telling.
Yeah. Sorry, Steve, if there was anything else you wanted to add.
Well, just something that Michel said really kind of triggered a memory. Not long before he died, my father asked me to get him the King James Bible in Spanish. And I said, first of all, I'm sure there isn't one, but there was. But I asked him, why do you want a King James Bible in Spanish? And he said, I'm going to learn to read it so I can talk about God to this woman who is working at a fruit stand here in Indianola. She was an immigrant from Mexico. He taught himself enough Spanish to talk to her.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, man, that's my little hometown, that you were either black or you were white there when I was growing up. And that's no longer true.
Mm-hmm.
It goes without saying that a city 5 million, 6 million like Atlanta, you see these changes over even the course of one generation. But as I was thinking to the Low Country in Charleston, I've been taking trips there frequently over the last 5-6 years, and the amount of change that you see in a city that has kind of portrayed itself over the years as sort of arch Southern has changed so much. Not only in its growth, but just in its textures and the way that it even presents itself. Let me ask you this question as well. We touched on where where Southern literature kind of fits into the broader picture here. as I think back to the history of Southern literature, back to the early 20th century, to folks like the fugitives and the agrarians out of Vanderbilt, to a certain extent, even out of Faulkner, there has been this sort of tension between Southern literature and American literature. And it seems that in the past, at least, Southern literature has sort of sustained itself by contrasting itself to American literature. Let me say that again. Southern literature has contrasted itself with American literature as a way to sort of identify itself. Do you feel that it needs to have that tension or that contrast to still be self-sustaining, to think of the, Michel, you mentioned Southern literature, Southerners as sort of this other that has been present in American thought. Do we still need that sense of otherizing? Does the South still need to be seen as the other for it to still have that sense of Southernness about it?
I don't think it has to. I think if it's good enough, it'll stand on its own. And I think, the more we tell stories of the specific, the more the stories are universal, right? So I can write a novel set in the low country of South Carolina on the Sea Islands about a particular character going through a particular series of events in a place that is very unique to that place. And maybe those events and those experiences are unique to that place. But if I tell it well enough, then that should be a universal story. I mean, I think all of our humanity is all connected, right? I mean, we're all connected no matter where we are. Yeah. And that sense of human emotion and is universal. So regardless of what the plot is, the characters are all connected. I mean, I think, so I guess the answer is no. I mean, a good Southern story would be a good story regardless of where it's read, where it's told.
That was often the biggest compliment I think Faulkner could get, is that in his little postage stamp of Yoknapatawpha County, his fictionalized world there, that he really did tell the universal tale. And you could open up any page and see a reference to, gosh, Greek and Roman mythology, the Civil War, and Napoleon, all maybe on one page and a half. Steve, how about you? And again, I'm kind of relying on your perspective living in New England, because it seems early on in Southern literature, especially when you think, for example, of how Southerners started to think of themselves politically after about 1830. And I don't need to get into why that is. It has something to do with a tariff, which most people don't even understand what that is. But that's when really Southerners started to kind of identify as their own distinct region with their own distinct culture. But a lot of it was in contrast to New England. So back to you then. Does Southern literature need American literature in whatever way you would want to define either of those terms to sort of sustain itself, to identify itself?
I don't think we need it to identify ourselves. I think by and large, we know who we are. I will say that we Southerners, in a place like Boston right now, I think their sense of us as the other is as strong as it was in 1950 and 1960. And
Explain that, will you?
Yeah, I hear it every day. I'll give you an example. I took part in a benefit thing up here about 2 or 3 years ago in Boston. I can't even remember what the benefit was for, but there were a lot of wealthy people who paid to sit at tables with writers. And there was a lawyer there who he was in his 40s, told me, I read your books. I don't know how you could live in the South. I mean, it's so racist. And I let it go, for a little while. And then I finally just had heard enough. And I said, what year were you born? And I think he said something like 1971. I said, well, then I'm sure your parents talked to you about the Boston bus crisis, right? No, he hadn't heard of that. I said, well, why don't you read a book called Common Ground by Anthony Lucas and look at the photos there of what happened to buses full of Black children in South Boston. They see us as the other, most definitely. Now, the question is, do we see them as the other? And that's what I can't answer, because you know, I've lived away for so long that my knowledge of places like my hometown, it's just not as deep as it once was.
Yeah.
But as far as the appetite for Southern literature, perhaps paradoxically, I don't see any dimming of that at all. I see Southern writers being asked to read at the Harvard bookstore and, you know, Brookline Booksmith. Pretty much everybody comes through here, or they will once we can start having real readings again in person.
You know, I want to piggyback on that, Steve. You just reminded me of something. So my firstborn child decided that she wanted to leave the South and go to boarding school in New England. None of us had done that before. So we said, okay, if you get in, we'll let you do it. Well, she did. And she went to school in New Hampshire. And she loved it and she thrived there. And it was just what she needed for her. But I remember when my husband and I went up for Parents Weekend and we're meeting the other parents and we're chatting. And then they asked, so where are you from? And I say, South Carolina. And you could just see this sort of surprise come over their faces. Like, you look like you have all your teeth. And, you know, is there a dead mule strapped to the rental car out there? So when you said that, yes, you're right. I mean, when we would visit up there, I would definitely feel this sense that we're still the other. They still think of us as these backward folk, yet they can't get enough of this Southern writing. So what is that? I don't know.
Southern writing, Southern music, Southern food,
Mm-hmm.
you know? Yeah, really.
You know, when I first moved to Tennessee 17 years ago, it dawned on me that in one state alone, we gave birth to, I say we, I'm a transplant myself, but Tennessee gave birth to, or at least was a midwife to, the blues, country music, bluegrass, rock and roll, Memphis alone, you know, not to mention all the writers there. And I just thought, wow, what one little state has been able to contribute to the cultural lifeblood of an entire country like this.
Sure.
Mississippi's another great example, just with its literature alone, Faulkner notwithstanding.
Yeah.
What it's been able to do. You know, it's easy for a panel with this topic to sort of devolve into a question of politics, especially current politics, because I'm sensing it, as so many other people are, that we seem to be as divided as culturally, just in terms of where we live, who we hang out with, who we talk to. As we've probably ever been. And in fact, I've talked about this with my students, that we talked at good length about the 1850s, about this decade before the country kind of split apart. And actually there was a flourishing of literature, North and South, a lot of it really sort of distinguishing itself from one another based on these issues of politics, of course, of slavery. Yeah, it has the sort of political polarization really created a sense of regionalism, or is that too simplistic a boundary? When we think about how the country is splitting apart, is it less north-south? Is it more rural-urban? And how is that reflected in something like the literature of today? I'll let either one of you field that hand grenade.
I don't think it's as simple as one region versus another region. And as an example, I live in a town that's 6 miles north of the absolute center of Boston. So everybody on my block here, I think, is politically, you know, very much on the left. All of us are. You know, I saw the yard signs. But I walk across the street and about 400 yards to the west, and the yard signs change. And about back during, I guess this would have been June, when high school graduation was going on, I was walking with my wife and suddenly it was kind of windy. I thought, did I just see a Confederate flag on that house? I looked again. It was a flag that had the US flag on one side and it had the Confederate flag on the other side. And that was in Stoneham, Massachusetts. which voted 60-40 during the last election. So you get outside the 495 Beltway here, and you get into central and western Mass, and with the exception of Worcester and Springfield, which are heavily Democratic cities, you got a solid sea of red. And then you get over to where all of the colleges and universities are in western Mass. Things change there a little bit. But it's always worth remembering that originally the John Birch Society was headquartered in Belmont, Massachusetts.
Was that right?
5 miles away from me. So how's that manifesting itself in literature? I'm not sure, because I think almost all of the writers I know, no matter where they live, are kind of on the same side politically. Mm-hmm. I don't think that was true prior to the Civil War. I think there were distinct regional differences.
Mm-hmm.
Michel?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just listening to you, and as you're speaking, I'm thinking about my own Southern identity and how I identify as a Southerner, and it's really all I've ever known. I think of that David Foster Wallace speech of the fish swimming by the other fish, and the older fish says to the younger fish, "How's the water?" And a little while later, the younger fish looks at his buddy and said, "What the hell is water?" I mean, I feel that way when we're talking about Southern influences and and how, in ways, I think we as people are sort of, we all get in our silos, right? Whether it's our silo of being a woman or a female, or being of the South, or being of a certain age, or being of a certain political stripe. And so back to your original question, I don't think it's just a regional pairing off, parsing out. I think people are just finding more and more ways to identify, and then entrenching into those identifiers, which is both good and bad. I don't know the answer to that, but everybody seems these days to want to dig in their heels about where they are, whatever their thing is, and instead of reaching across aisles. And I'm not just talking about politics. So I don't know what that even says about what we're talking about, but it's just an interesting time to be alive, to be a person in our country.
It really will. And it'll be interesting 20 years from now to be able to read the literature coming out now that's set in our current day, to see how it's perceived. God knows where we'll be in terms of our political situation or our sense of national, regional unities 20 years from now. I can't tell you where we'll be a year from now or 5 years from now. But I think this is kind of a temperamental time. And I find that the literature will be reflecting this in one form or another. Steve, you were going to say something. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was just agreeing with you. But one thing I will toss into the mix, I teach in a really good creative writing program. And we've got a lot of kids here as undergrads who are majoring in creative writing. Something that I have seen over the last 2 or 3 years is that they are starting to want to draw clear distinctions between good and bad. And
it's not the first time I've heard that.
Yep, that's what's starting to happen. I had students complain that in the last edition of Best American Short Stories, too many of the bad people went unpunished. And also they felt that the writers were asking them to feel empathy for bad people, and this was bothersome to them.
Yes.
And I'm starting to wonder if we aren't going to see a flattening out of character in fiction, so that I hope this won't happen, but I am entertaining the possibility that we're going to start seeing characters who are position papers, essentially.
Yes. I encountered a situation just recently teaching Absalom, where very quickly the conversation, which is, if you've read that novel, just how complex a discussion it is about race, especially, but how quickly it also turned to the author's thoughts on race coming out of 1936. And I wasn't sure how many of the students I would be able to pull along from that discussion to continue the novel. if they couldn't find that kind of clarity that you were talking about in the characters or in the author himself. Michelle, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that as well, but this flattening out, I'm starting to see it myself.
Yeah, it's super disturbing, actually. My first novel came out in 2012, so it's been a while, and it had a couple of Southern white protagonists and a couple of undocumented immigrant from Mexico protagonists. And the book, I don't know that I could have pulled that off in 2021, 2022. That book was picked for the community-wide read in a town in Oregon, of all places. So here I am from the bottom right corner of the country, and a town in the top left corner of the country picked it for their community read. And I'd never been to Oregon. And they said they chose it because their town was 40% Hispanic, because it's on the Columbia River and it's an agricultural community. A lot of crops there. There's a cannery. They have a port there where they ship out their agriculture. And I was really touched because they said they chose it because they thought it was a book that the entire population could relate to. And interestingly, there were very few African Americans in that community, but mostly white folks and Hispanic folks. And I remember feeling actually very nervous before. They had almost like a town hall type event there when they had me out there. And it was composed, the panel was the mayor, the police chief, and somebody from city council and I, in a big room, and they wanted to talk about immigration, and which, I'm a fiction writer. I make this up. Like, I'm not a political pundit. I'm a little, but anyway, it was interesting. It's interesting to me how even since, well, by the way, and that experience was very positive. I mean, during the Q&A, I got some really positive feedback from some folks in the community who'd read the book. And even though I, as a white Southern woman, had written it, there were folks who were Hispanic who'd spent much of their adult lives in Oregon who said they could relate to these characters that I developed who ended up in South Carolina, which nearly brought me to tears. It was the nicest thing anybody could say about my writing. But over the last decade, I've thought a lot about that experience, wondering what it would be like today, just in the shift of how people sort of, cultural appropriation, and how there's a lot of thought of, a white woman probably only needs to be writing about white characters, and a gay man better only write about, or a white man better not write about a black man, or a straight man better not write about the gay, and all these things. And to me, that's a shame, because that's the point of fiction. It strikes our imagination. It builds empathy. We see from other people's lenses. And if we can only tell stories from our own lens, I think that's a crying shame.
I think you're right. I think empathy will be the big casualty, the first and biggest casualty of that flattening out, as Steve said, or, this narrow perspective that an author would be allowed to to focus on in his or her writing, right?
Yeah, I'm not going to play by those rules myself. I'm gonna do what I've always done. My new novel is written from the point of view of two women characters, one of whom is not strictly heterosexual. It's too late in the game for me to change.
Don't.
Yeah. Like Michelle, I've always written what I cared about. I think it is a horrible thing if we can only tell stories about ourselves. To me, it's just in some basic way anti-humanistic.
I couldn't agree more. Well, my new novel, I just turned it into my agent last week, and it's got Southern white folks in it, but it also has some people from Honduras in it. And I'm unapologetic about that, because if we can't reach out and interact with people different from us in our fiction, how the hell are we going to do it in real life, for Pete's sake?
That's
exactly right.
Really.
That's exactly right. We have 9 minutes left of this panel, and I'd like to take some of this time to field any questions from our viewership, from our attendees. And one is coming through right now. I'll just read the comment, and it's more of a comment than a question. But this attendee is saying how glad she is that we're addressing this particular issue, and remarks that it's almost paralyzing when writing not to become a target of anger and of cancellation. And I wonder about that in your own readership. I mean, is this to what extent will this affect the ability to sell books, or to to attract a wide enough readership? If this flattening out is not just a problem among potential writers, future writers, those in your creative writing class, Steve, but also in a readership.
I think that's impossible to tell, to be honest. I feel like about the last 7 or 8 of my books have been published into a completely different publishing world than the one before them. And so trying to guess is just, I think it's just a total mistake. I feel like you write what you care about, you care deeply about it, and you put it out there and you live with the result. So I don't spend a lot of time trying to calculate that. I'm sure Michel doesn't either.
No, I don't. I mean, the last thing, you can't self-edit. I mean, this stuff just, you write what you want to write, and you write the stories, and there, you know what? There may be people out there who criticize it. And I think there's a certain contingent that just waits to pounce on stuff like this. They find great joy in breaking down other people's work. But I will say the vast majority of people love a good story. Humans love a good story, and a good story is going to have a diversity of character, a diversity of experiences. And so the world in ways may become more and more this way, but the truth is the desire for a good story is not going to go away. And so I think those of us who are telling them and writing them have to sort of block all that nonsense out. I remember as a beginning writer, one of my first teachers said, you're always going to have that critic, whoever it is, whether it's in my first book, I had a rape scene. And I remember writing that going, oh my God, my dad is going to read this. My dad is going to read this. But I had to block that out and write what I wanted to write, because that's the story I wanted to tell. And that's just what we have to do as writers. And ultimately, the stories we write are going to be better because of it. We can't self-edit before we even get the story down.
Yeah.
Hear, hear. And I should say that cancellation is nothing new to the literary world. I mean, literature's been dealing with this. And we may have a set of terms that we now use: cancel culture, woke, whatnot. But these are actually issues that authors have been having to deal with.
They're just on steroids now, though, because of social media.
That's right. That's right. I'd love to see if anyone else, any of our attendees would like to chime in. We've still got an extra 5 minutes before we have to conclude the panel. If not, we can always, I've got a few more questions. I'm just waiting to see if anything comes through the chat mechanism here. Well, until that time, let me ask you then, if you could pinpoint 2, maybe 3 Southern authors who have been most influential to you, either because of their stylistics, their themes, you name it, who would they be? Michelle, I'll start with you.
Well, my buddy Ron Rash, we were talking about him before we were going live.
That's right.
And he's always been a mentor and a dear, dear friend of mine. And I know he and Steve are very close as well. But Ron, for sure, I guess just his use of language and the fact that he is a poet, the way he turns a phrase and his use of language has always inspired me. And then the fact that he's just a wonderful human being who always takes my calls when I'm having some sort of existential crisis about something. But before that, Welty, Eudora Welty, something about her writing has always appealed to me. And I go back and read her stories over and over again. So yeah, those are 2.
Great.
Yeah. Ron is certainly my best writer friend. And I think Ron is as good a short story writer as has ever graced this planet. I mean, I think the guy is that good. I love his novels too. His stories are just up there with Monroe and Trevor and anybody else I would name. You know, a writer who's really important to me, and I don't think she's ever gotten her due, was Elizabeth Spencer. And I got to be her friend, you know, over the last 10 or 11 years. Apparently she referred to me as that sweet boy from Indianola. But you know, she moved
You'll
around.
never outgrow where you were from.
She moved around. She wrote beautifully about the Delta. She wrote beautifully about Italy. And I just think she was a spectacular stylist. And I don't know if we can consider him Southern or not. I kind of do. Larry McMurtry was really important.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Great. Looking to see if anything else has come through through the chat. Steve, I wanted to touch on something. Well, actually, you both have mentioned, Michelle, you too, Eudora Welty, and the way that writers challenge us to think beyond tough characters, mean actions. And I can't remember the individual name of the story, the name of the individual story, but it's in the Golden Apples, where the premise is that a husband slaps his wife and then goes on a long walk. And it's such a jarring way to start a story, as you can imagine, for all the reasons. But as he's taking this walk along the city, and they're in New York, you're realizing actually that their daughter died, and that he hasn't been able to process the grief of that any more than his wife has, who's been left back at home dealing with the effect of this slap. And we're challenged to try to see the world through his grief-stricken eyes, and to do so by first having known him as having, you know, done something so harsh to his wife, so unspeakable to his wife. But boy, was it a great story to be able to try to think about a little bit about humility and about empathy. And this is Eudora Welty doing this back in the 40s. And I can remember the name of the individual story, but it's in the Golden Apples. I don't know if you recall it. Here's another question coming up with a minute and a half to go. Has the pandemic influenced your writing at all? Staying home a lot.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm sure that it has in ways that I don't even realize yet and may come to me as time goes on. I certainly a lot more time at home. Yeah, and I did get I suppose I got a lot more writing done because there were fewer interruptions of other things that, you know, no driving to and from meetings, everything right there on the Zoom. So yeah, I suppose I was more productive in ways, got a lot more done. Yeah, and probably other things too that I'm not even aware of.
I was finishing my novel after the pandemic started, and the ending got it got darker than I was comfortable with. And I took a little break and came back and rewrote some sections because I thought, I don't want this book to look like it started in one world and it ended in another.
Yeah. You know, the pandemic gave me a lot to think about in terms of region. When we were trying to find ways to get out and space out, I thought about how lucky I was actually to be living in the South, where these falls drag on well into December. Springtime comes a lot sooner, and how much easier it is to live through a pandemic when you don't have to bundle up and just to go outside. A place like Minnesota or a place like New England.
Yeah. Would
affect my writing, I'm not sure. But
and you know, too, thinking about that, like I say, I was more productive because I just had more time at the desk writing. But I also have found in the last few months, as it's starting to free up a little, as the world, at least my world, is starting to free up a little bit. You know, at the beginning of this, my children were all out of school, doing school, even my college ones, home on the computer. And then now everybody's back in school full time. So even though I was having more time at the desk to write, I have felt this sort of logjam freeing up in my brain as the world is starting to come back online.
Yeah,
I think I'm able to think more clearly and more deeply than I was during the pandemic, because even though I had more time at the desk, I think I wasn't sleeping well. I think I had this sort of unconscious, subconscious sort of worry deep into my soul. I mean, I remember telling my doctor, I'm not sleeping well. And he said, neither am I, neither is he.
Join the club.
So I think there was just sort of this worry going on that is lifting a little bit for me.
Yeah.
So
We are at 11:47, which brings us to the end of our panel. Michel Stone, Steve Yarbrough, I want to thank you so much for a great conversation. Let me just give one last plug for two of the most recent books. Here's Michel's most recent book, and I think it's coming to you probably in the wrong direction because of my my Zoom screen here. But this is Border Child by Michel Stone. I referenced it just briefly earlier in today's panel. And Steve's latest book, The Unmade World. Now, he does have another one coming out, and that one will be out, did we say April 2020?
April.
Is that right? And that'll be Stay Gone Days. So look forward for that title. These titles, of course, are out. You can get them at any actual retailer or online retailer. They're terrific reads. Steve's will take you all the way to Poland. Michel's will give you a great geography of Central and Northern Mexico. Wonderful reads, and I'm so grateful to both of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Michel.
Thank you both. Thanks so much.
And thank you all. Thank you, Aaron, for our great discussion. That was just
Gladly.
really encouraging. So I will also mention, since you're talking about bookstores, we have a new independent bookstore that's open this weekend, Book and Cover on Hampton in North Chattanooga. So we love having an independent bookstore back in town. Go check it out. I'm sure they can order any of these books for you, and let's get them started on the road.
For the 7 people in Chattanooga who still have a print version of the newspaper, of the local paper, it's the front page of the regional section, or maybe the business section. Check it out. It looks great.
Yeah, we're so excited. So thank you all. So we will have George Singleton up next at 12 o'clock. So we're going to completely sign off, and everybody can just log back in at 12, and we will hear from George and about some of his great short stories. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Aaron. Bye, guys.